Okay, so with that, let's talk about why we're here. EKGs, right? So you guys are the only ones awake this morning and not still, hungover or drunk, right? So welcome to being the nerdiest people in Las Vegas. I have no disclosures except for the story I just shared with you. All right, so let's talk about EKGs in terms of why, right, and why it's important. And it's more than just the squiggly lines and that number that Rick told us about in terms of how many we have the chance to read in our daily practices. Sometimes it feels like it's like 100% of the patients, right, are getting EKGs that you're having to read. So let's talk about where EKGs come from. So back in the day, before they had iPhones and, Alexa, right? People did science. They actually did things to understand about the body and about physics and chemistry and biology. So Luigi Galvani and his assistant are skinning frog legs. They're trying to understand the various kind of humors, as they used to call them, of biology. And he takes his scalpel and he sets it down, and the assistant picks up the scalpel, and as he's moving the scalpel over, he happens to touch an exposed nerve on the frog that they've been dissecting, and the leg twitches, right? Which, good thing that wasn't me, because I would have twitched myself right out of that room. I don't do frogs very well. So the leg twitches, and it's the first time that people understand that perhaps muscle movement is related to electric movement, right? Electricity is creating muscle movement in a body. Fast forward about 200 years, and so here's Eindhoven with the machine we all use and love now, except his machine was actually 500 pounds and took 5 people to move it, and was in a different building than where the patient actually was, right? So being transmitted almost by radio frequency, and you can see one foot is in like a bath, which doesn't seem like the safest thing to tell a patient to do, like stick your foot with this electrode in this bucket of water, and let's see what happens to it, right? So we've come a long way from the 500-pound model to what we have today. So in terms of the EKG, this is it, guys, right? It's really just this simple. I think we make it more complicated than it needs to be. There's electricity, and it's moving in a direction. And technically, in the correct physiologic pathway, that electric axis is starting somewhere on the right side, and it's moving towards the left arm and down towards the left leg. And that is technically how all the vectors in a normal pathophysiologic state should be working and moving and flowing. All right, so let's start with placement of electrodes, right? Which you're looking at me, for those of you I can see without the light in my eye up here, and you're thinking, why do we need to know this? So why do you need to know this? Because when you get handed an EKG and something about it doesn't look right, whether the something about it that doesn't look right is a true positive, there's something really not right with the heart, or it's just that the technique was wrong, you need to know the difference, right? So you need to understand how that EKG was acquired. So if there's a problem with it, then you can troubleshoot that problem and get the EKG you actually want to take a better look at the patient. So assuming that the right arm is the white lead, right, or the snow lead, snow sits over grass, which is green. So the green lead goes on the right leg. On the left arm being the black lead or the smoke lead, right? Smoke sits over fire. So the red fire goes on the left leg, right? So snow, grass, and smoke, fire, right? It's for the colors. Luckily, the rest of the precordials have V1, V2, and they usually have colors on them, so you know where to put them. But understanding, again, where those lead placements go, right? So that V1 is going to be on the right side on the precordial wall of the chest, somewhere around the sternal angle, right, between ribs 1 and 2. V2 goes directly across from it. Then you put V4 down, then you put V6 down, and you put V3 and V5 in between those two. Okay, so that way you know that the EKG was obtained correctly. This is roughly what it looks like, right, with looking at the right arm and the left arm, and the right leg and the left leg in terms of the colors on the electrodes. Sometimes we just do a 5 lead, right? We have the initial 12 lead, then we want the patient to be monitored continuously, so we have a 5 lead. This is what the 5 lead placement looks like, where instead of all of those precordial slices that we take. We just drop the chest lead on there or the brown lead. All right, so we have a rhythm and it conducts, right? It squeezes, there's depolarization, there's contraction, and then there's repolarization. Again, simple, right? Something simple that the heart is doing that produces a wave on your EKG grid. P waves, where do they come from? They should always come from the sinus node, right? The normal P wave comes from a sinus node. There's a depolarization, there's an atrial contraction, which is short enough, then it conducts down into the right and left ventricles, you have a full squeeze, you have a repolarization, that gives you your full EKG as you look at it on the grid paper. How long should a P wave last on the little piece of grid paper? So less than 0.1, right? So if you're looking at your EKG grid, that big deep, those big red lines, in between those are 5 little tiny boxes, and each little tiny box is about 0.04. So the P wave should really be about 2 of those little tiny boxes, maybe partly into the third one, right? But that's about how much a P wave should be in its width. So let's talk about P waves. Technically speaking, the right atrium does squeeze just before the left atrium does, but that millisecond fraction is so small that we just kind of see it as a P wave, right? So when you're looking at this, I've put it into colors of the right atrium going first, and the left atrium kind of by cell to cell fires immediately, and you get this nice little P wave morphology or axis. I don't think the mouse is going, guys. So again, when you're looking at that grid paper, you see the big square grid lines, and within that box are 5 little tiny boxes, right, which are each 0.04. So you see that that P wave technically takes up about 2 of those little boxes, okay, which is what it should when it's normal. When you have right atrial enlargement, and we'll talk about why it's important to recognize this on an EKG, what you get is a right atrium that squeezes and makes a tall P wave, okay? So you get a P wave that is taller than normal, as you see here in front of you, okay? So it's a little bit taller than 2 boxes tall. In left atrial enlargement, what you get is a wider P wave, okay? Because the right one squeezed, the left is working on it, but it's taking it a little bit longer because the left atrium is stretched, so that goes a little bit wider than normal. Why does it matter? What if you did have right atrial enlargement on an EKG? What would that tell you? That when that right heart has been squeezing all of those years, right, it's squeezing against some kind of resistance that has made it stretch. Okay, so maybe there's right ventricular hypertrophy. Maybe there's pulmonary hypertension. Okay, when there's left atrial enlargement, what does that tell you? Same thing, right? That left chamber is floppy and it's dilated, and the question is why did it become dilated? So maybe there's LVH. Maybe there's regurgitation that's flowing back into that left atrium, okay? Now I know all of you in this room love rushing in to talk to your patients, right? Because they're such captivating people, right? But if you could piece together a lot of their puzzle before you walked into the room, you see how much more you'd have with you when you walked in, and you could kind of focus their history, or you could focus your line of questioning to make it more convenient for both you and the patient in that room. Not to say it's not great to spend, 30-some minutes talking to somebody in the ER, right? But if you could spend 3 or 4 and get really great information before you walked in because you had all of this in your head already for a differential, that's the purpose of the EKG. So here's some P waves, right? At the very top, you'll see there's normal, which just looks like a nice normal kind of upside down U-ish shape. Always upright in lead 2. Again, when you're looking at your limb leads and the placement, your P wave should always be positive deflection in lead 2. In V1, which is that right-sided precordial lead, you may get a biphasic fluctuation, right? Because again, As we talked about the vectors, they're positive on the right side and they're flowing rightwards and downwards. So you may get that little kind of biphasic V1 notch as you see there. We talked about right atrial enlargement where it's a taller wave, and we've talked about left atrial enlargement where it's a wider P wave. And then you have the really pathophysiologic heart where you have both RAE and LAE, and then you get a tall and a wide P wave. Okay? But again, looking at that now, you already have in your mind a lot of differential for what is going on in that patient's heart before you ever walk in that room. All right, so SA node, right, it fires. We just talked about the P wave and that depolarization part of it, hits the AV node, down into your bundle of His Purkinje fibers, big squeeze in the ventricles, repolarization, next cycle of the heartbeat. So QRS complexes are meant to be narrow. Rick, at the introduction, talked about, wouldn't it be nice if the EKG could just actually tell you something accurate about the patient? So my personal bias is the following. That EKG, when it spits out at you, those numbers at the top, those are great numbers. I can't do that. I mean, I can't do that kind of math, right? Can you do square roots and division that quickly with those little tiny boxes? No. But the computer is very, very good at doing that for you. That is what you should be using the computer for. All the other stuff it tells you, that's nice. Thank you for the suggestion, computer. I'm going to make my own interpretation of this EKG. The computer can be useful for those mathematical numbers like the QTC that it gives you, the P wave width that it gives you. That part is good from the computer spit out. So QRS complexes are meant to be narrow, right? And they can look in all kinds of different ways. And we'll talk about those as we go through our morning in more depth. So in general, when you're looking at the QRS complex, it's narrow, right? So it's going to be maybe about 2 boxes wide in total, so 0.06 to 0.10 seconds wide, the little boxes on your EKG. The Q wave is going to be particularly the skinniest part of that little deflection, where it's going to be just about the width of that one of those little tiny boxes. Did everybody just kind of collectively go, oh, right? Okay, because here's the axis part. So the schematic at the bottom, the spokes at the bottom, are what I feel like every cardiologist I've ever interacted with, or even in physiology in med school, they love to toss us up there, right? Like I think it's like their job security of, yeah, I can read the spokes. Okay, that's cool, all good. Let me simplify it for you. So we talked about the right atrium here, firing left and downwards, right? Correct? Yes? Okay. So you see the little skinny man at the top of that screen? I'm sorry, the mouse is not working. So again, the vectors are going to go to the left and they're going to go down. And you'll see up there, there's R, which is AVR, there's L, which is AVL, and there's F, which is AV foot. If you took those vectors and put them on the spokes at the bottom, you will see again, there's an AVL platform, there's an AVR at the plus 30, and then there's an AVF at the plus 90 at the very bottom. Thank you. All right. The spokes are still there. So let's make it a little simpler. If we assume that lead 1 is a left-sided lead, oh, thank you very much. Then we look at AVF as that perpendicular lead to lead 1, and we make it our right-sided lead, okay? And that's how we figure out the axis. We're gonna look at 1 and AVF. So we're gonna do some examples of this. All right, everyone, take your hands out. This is your stretch for the morning. Rick and I talked about this room. It's such a big, beautiful room. We thought we should do like yoga or something in the back. You know? Anyway, so take out your hands right in front of you. So this is what your hands are going to be used for every single day now, going forward looking at EKGs. Why do we have thumbs? You would argue because we're humans. No, it's in fact so we can look at the axis on the EKG. All right, so here are your thumbs, correct? You're looking at your EKG. The QRS deflection is positive in lead 1, okay, which is our left-sided lead, so our left thumb is up. And it is positive in AVF, which is our right-sided perpendicular lead. So we have positive and positive, so our axis is, we have 2 thumbs up. That's good, right? So it's normal. Okay, so back to our hands. Now we're looking at the EKG. Our lead 1 on our limb lead is positive. That's our left lead, okay? And our foot, AVF, or our right perpendicular lead is negative. What thumb is up? Please, somebody say left. Okay, good, right? So if your left thumb is up, that's left axis deviation. So far, so good? Okay, so shake off those hands again. Now you're looking at your EKG, okay? Your lead 1 is negative, so your left lead is negative. Your AV foot, your right perpendicular lead is positive. What thumb is up? You're right. So what axis is this? It's right axis. Good? Now, in the case where it's negative and negative, either you are way right axis or you're way left axis, and then at that point, the rest of the EKG will help you determine whether you have LVH or RVH or what else is going on, or a paced rhythm, et cetera, et cetera. Good with the thumbs? Yes? Okay. Okay, so let's look at this EKG, right? So all we're looking at right now is the axis. So we're gonna get our little hands again, our nice human opposable thumbs. And our QRS deflection is positive in 1, yes? There, right? So we're upright in 1, which is our left, and our QRS and AV foot, which is our right-sided perpendicular lead, is. So what axis is this? Normal, absolutely. Okay. See, it's literally just that easy. All right, another axis. Here is 1, right? So the QRS is more positive than negative, so we'll give that a positive in 1. Here is F. The QRS is definitely negative. What thumb is up? Left. Okay, so this is left axis. Okay, now this one we will all do together from your seats, right? So lead 1, the QRS is negative, and in AVF, the QRS is positive. What axis is this? Right. Okay, good. Class done. Why does it matter? So that's great, right? We talked about P waves, we talked about right axis enlargement, we talked about left atrial enlargement. That's great. Why do you care? This is why you care. If you have right axis deviation, right? So when you're looking at your 1 and your F, it's like this, okay? You have right axis deviation, and let's say you have a P wave suggestive of right atrial enlargement. What can you now tell about the patient's heart, potentially, before you walk in that room? Look at this. They might have an acute lung problem, which is why they just showed up in your ED, okay? They might have that acute PE from flying from Florida to Vegas and not getting up because the drink cart was in the way, right? They might. They might have chronic lung disease. So they have chronic lung strain that creates right ventricular hypertrophy, that backs up to the right atrium, that gives you atrial enlargement, that creates a right axis deviation. If they have left axis deviation, so you're positive in 1 and you're negative in AVF on your QRS complex, what is that going to tell you? Important things. Is there an inferior MI going on? Right? Do they have LVH? Do they have hypertension that nobody has treated for all of these years until they just hit the door of your emergency department today? So this is why you care. It's not to be fancy and just to run around going like, oh, I can look at EKGs, because guess what? I think the iPhone or the iWatch, right, is coming out with some technology for AFib. So soon, some Alexa was going to tell you what the EKG reads. But this is why you want to know what that interpretation means for you and for the patient. Okay. So moving on, at QRS complexes. Anything kind of jump out at you on this page? So when I was a resident, just a handful of years ago, not really, I had a cardiology attending. I just loved him. He was my height, which is why I really loved him. But two, he was this really sweet man from Cuba, and he would look at these EKGs like the one you're looking at, and he would go, Joyce, look at this. In this is like the cousins are kissing. It's a little dirty, but the cousins are kissing. Like he would say this stuff all the time. So what he meant was, see these little cousins right here? The S wave and the R wave, and subsequently the S wave here and this R wave. They land on top of each other, right? So here we have left ventricular hypertrophy. So there are multiple criteria that you can use. I should have said my disclosure was I'm really great at languages. I am not great at math. So this is the criteria that I like because it's simple. So this is the Sokolov Lion criteria. You're going to take your S wave in V1, okay, and you're going to add it to the number of boxes of the R wave in V5 or V6. You pick whichever R wave is more prominent and easier to see. So if you calculate up the boxes, right? So if you imagine that each of these big heavily lined boxes is 5 millimeters, which it is. So we start here-ish. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. What's 5 times 5? 25, yes. We're going to add 25, which is this S wave in V1. We're going to add that 25 to, let's take this one because it's very tall. We're going to add that to, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 boxes on the R wave in V6. What's 5 times 5? 25. What's 25 plus 25? 50. Okay? Moral of the story. If the S wave in V1 added to the R wave in V5 or V6 totals more than 7 boxes, you have LVH. Make sense? Yes? Okay. It's not complicated math because I cannot do complicated math. So, what's our axis here? Is your QRS up or down in 1? It's down. Is it up or down in ABF? Down, right? And you have some kind of right bundle, so it's severe right axis. The point is here, we have right axis deviation, and we also have criteria for right ventricular hypertrophy, where the R wave here in V1 is clearly much taller than the S wave, and in V6, your S wave is much deeper on the other end than your R wave. Okay? So R greater than S and S greater than R. Right ventricular hypertrophy. Right? And again, it is important to know what these are electrophysiologically, but remembering we also want to understand the pathophys associated with the electrophys, right? Like, why does the patient have RVH? Why is the patient here today? What does this EKG telling us about their heart or their system that we can glean right now before we go in and talk to them? The T wave is your repolarization phase. It should always be upright, and we'll talk about why it is not upright, what that means for the patient. Lots of different ways to clearly look at T waves. At the top, you have normal, and you have those kind of nonspecifics. These ones down below, and Fred is going to go into much greater depth here shortly about these are the ones that you worry about. This is why it's important to know what a normal EKG should look like. So when something pops up that is not normal, then it alerts you, and you can start to think about the differential of that T wave and what it is symbolizing for the patient. The U wave is that little itty-bitty tiny deflection after the T wave, which half the time you can't even see and it's not important. Here's when it becomes important. When it's prominently upright, then these are the conditions that it could symbolize. Severe hypokalemia, which you will also have T wave changes with that, right? Hypercalcemia, right? So the hypercalcemia of malignancy, for example, that patient will have a very prominent upright U wave, which again, if you look at any normal EKG, half the time that U wave is kind of buried along with the T and it moves on. You never notice it. So if you know what normal is, then when you see something abnormal, like a very prominent upright U wave, now you can catch something potentially lethal for that patient. And then, of course, here's our friend DIGE, which creates all kinds of troubles on EKGs because of its cardiac conduction physiology. When the U wave is flipped, same thing. It notifies us that something bad is happening for the patient. Now, assuming that if they're having an acute ischemic event, you will see that reflected as a STEMI, which you should, but maybe they've come in at that very early phase before you have those big tombstone patterns, right? Or maybe they've come at the end of their non-STEMI event, and they've had some ischemic event, and you now have a very prominent deflection of a negative U wave. The QT interval should be about 0.42 seconds, right? And that is where the computer is helpful. When you're looking at the QTC, the computer is great for giving you a square root of some computation. That part the computer is great at. When you're looking at an EKG, much like when you're looking at any diagnostic tool, whether that be a chest x-ray, whether that be a head CT, whether that be your labs that you're looking at, right? You should always have a system. Why should you always have a system? How many of you in your day-to-day work in the emergency department can sit quietly and just think about a patient? Okay, so when you don't have a system and you don't do something the same way every single time, you're going to miss something. Which is why I think we do it not realizing that we are doing it, right? But we do it when we look at x-rays. We do it when we look at our labs. Maybe some of you always look at sodium and potassium first. Maybe some of us always look at the glucose for whatever reason first. But we have a system of how we do that so we don't miss things, right? A heuristic pattern that we use. Same thing for the EKG. This is the one that I like to use. It does not mean that one that you should use, but I like to look at the rate, the rhythm. I like to look at all of my waves, the segments, the complexes, and then usually by then I will have already kind of glossed over and looked at the axis, but if you want to put the axis before the rate, that's fine too, but just pick a system and use it every single time. So the rate, as many of you know, you find the heaviest dark line you can find, that darkest pink line, right, which signifies one solid grid of a box. You find the QRS that falls on it, and then you start counting downwards, right? So your next heavy dark line is going to be 300, 150, 100, 75, 50, and onwards, okay? Again, often the computer is great at telling you what the rate is. Sometimes it's not so great because it either miscounts or it starts to double count paced rhythms, for example. Okay, when you're looking at a rhythm, who started the rhythm, right? Like, where does it come from? Is it sinus? Is it junctional? Is it ventricular? What is the rate? Whoever started the pacing, is that the rate that you expected them to pace this heart? So if that rate is coming from the sinus node, then does it likely follow a 60 to 100 beat per minute cycle? Or is it faster than you thought it was going to be? Or is it slower than you thought it was going to be? How regular is it? Regularly regular, right? Like normal sinus rhythm. Is it regularly irregular? Is it irregularly irregular? And that will help to tell you, again, in that heuristic pattern, what that rate and rhythm likely are and who's creating that in the heart. Last but definitely not least is this rhythm coming because it's an active pacing or because it's some overdrive that somebody took over for a pacemaker that had not captured properly? These are in the book. I'm not going to belabor this because, again, it's just the different intervals and what their rates and times should be. But if you want to put this somewhere, like snapshot it, put it in your phone, look at it compared to what the EKG spits out for you, this is a great tool to have. All right, so let's go through quickly a couple of EKGs. So we're going to interpret this one. And since I'm standing in this box, then we'll use my system, right? So what's the rate? And I'm going to admit, you get to this age, first of all, where readers are no longer optional. I'm not really loving this age so much. And then the light makes it hard to see the big grids. But if we assume that that is a deep, heavy line right there, right, then we have 300, 150, 100-ish, right? So we're just above 100. Everyone agree with that? Okay. So we'll say 100 for the rate. What's our rhythm? I hear sinus, yes, right? So if you're looking here in lead 2, there is a P that comes before every QRS. And why did I pick lead 2? Because that's where you should always have an upright P wave, yes? So there's a P before every QRS, so we will call this sinus tach, right? Because we know that the rate is sinus. We expect the rate to be 60 to 100, but it's actually a little bit over 100, so we're going to call it sinus tach. What is do anything stand out to you in terms of P waves or QRS complexes, ST segments? So these T waves, right, are symmetrical, but they're definitely inverted. And you might expect an inverted T wave in V1 because that is a negative deflection away from the right side of the heart, but you certainly don't really expect it to remain negative as you're coming down to the left side of the heart. The axis. So the QRS is kind of isoelectric in 1, and it's upright in AVF. Maybe we'll call it positive in 1. So it's normal axis. Okay. How about this one? So here again, our rate, let's pick this line right here. So 300, 150, 100, 75, 60, 50-ish. Okay, so our rate's 50. What's our rhythm? Who's pacing us? Maybe I can convince you there's a P wave here, right? So we'll call it sinus Brady. Yep, because it's sinus paced, but the rate is less than 60, so it's sinus bradycardia. Nothing really stands out. I don't really see anything fancy about the P wave. The QRS looks nice and skinny. The T waves are upright when they should be. Nothing superbly prominent happening here. What's our axis? We are negative in 1, positive in AVF. So we're right axis. So right axis, sinus Brady. And so we have right axis. Can we say that we have RVH? No, not really. All right, this one here. I'll let you tell me the rate, because I really can't see any dark lines from up here. 100? Okay, we'll go with that. Rhythm? Sinus rhythm at 100, okay. P waves look nice and upright. QRSs to me here look skinny. T waves look normal, in their kind of normal range. Nothing else there stands out. The axis, up in 1, and isoelectric or down in AVF. So we'll call it left. Okay, so we have left axis. So what else should we look for? Should we look for LVH? Let's do that, huh? All right, so here, I'm going to say 1, 2, 3 boxes on our S wave in V1. 3 plus another 1, 2, 3, 4, 5-ish. So 3 boxes here and 5 boxes here is 8 boxes. And 8 boxes multiplied by 5 is 40. So it's greater than 35. So we also have LVH. Okay, last 3 questions, and then it's Fred's turn. So you're looking at the axis on an EKG. You're trying to determine it. Your QRS is upright in lead 1. It is negative in AVF. The axis on this EKG is left is correct. This EKG that you see in front of you has changes most consistent with which of the following problems? I'll give you a clue. There might be some cousins on this page. Certainly, yes. So it is LVH, right? If we were to add up these boxes here, and let's pick V6 because there's just so many of them, we clearly are more than 35 millimeters. So left ventricular hypertrophy. And last one here, when you're looking at the rhythm, you are specifically considering all of the following except, do you want to know who started the pacing? Yes. So you want to know the site? Do you want to know if the rate matches the site? Yes, you do. Do you want to know if it's regular in its rate? Yes. So by default, the axis doesn't play any part in the rhythm. Okay. I'll see you all shortly.